Hello and a very warm welcome to everybody joining me for another episode of Inside SA Media, which is proudly brought to you by Tribox Media and Fact Fort. My name is Lungisengyo Onachia. Absolutely thrilled to be here with you one more time. Once hailed as a pillar of South Africa's free press, independent newspapers was home to iconic titles like the Cape Times, the Star, and the Sunday Independent. These are newsrooms that carried the weight of public trust and really held power to account. But in the space of just a few years, the legacy would come under threat. At the heart of it all, a controversial takeover, newsroom purges, legal threats, and the slow erosion of editorial independence. This is not just a story of a business deal gone wrong. It's the story of what happens when media power becomes concentrated in the hands of political allies and corporate interests. It's a case study in control, consequence, and the cost of speaking out. In this episode, we unpack the rise and fall of independent newspapers under Sekunjalo, the removal of veteran editors, and of course the growing fears over South Africa's shrinking space for media press freedom. This is the people's paper, folded, sold, and silenced.
In a free South Africa that a major media group is 100% black-owned. The Sekunjalo Independent Media Consortium says it's not put off by arguments that newspapers globally are a dying breed, especially with the advent of digital media. It says the business is currently profitable and it plans to keep it that way. Sekunjalo says the African continent will form a big part of its growth strategy. Chairman Iqbal Survé says at the recent BRICS Business Summit, other African media houses indicated an interest to partner with the new independent.
I think over the next 12 months you're going to see some really interesting partnerships, possibly acquisitions on the African continent as well.
The Pan-African Business Forum has welcomed the new ownership. It's hoping the new structure will tell African stories better and provide solutions to its challenges. Survé says the consortium, which consists of community, labor and women groupings, as well as the Sekunjalo Group, will serve to ensure more inclusive news. Kositom, SABC News.
In the early 2010s, South Africa's print media landscape was undergoing major transformation. Newspaper circulation was declining and advertising revenue was shrinking, and the digital age was tightening its grip. Independent News and Media South Africa had been one of the country's biggest publishing houses. Owned by the Irish-based Independent News and Media PIC, the group included more than a dozen prominent titles. I'm talking Cape Times, The Star, Pretoria News, Sunday Independent, and others. But by 2012, INMSA was under pressure. The Irish parent company, itself of course dealing with mounting debt and internal financial turmoil, was looking to offload its South African assets. This was a chance for local ownership to step in. Enter Dr. Iqbal Survé, a medical doctor turned businessman and chairman of Sekunjalo Investments. In 2013, a Sekunjalo-led consortium, Sekunjalo Independent Media or SIM, acquired INMSA for approximately $2 billion in what was presented as a bold step towards a media transformation and a greater black ownership within the industry. Dr. Iqbal styled himself as a progressive disruptor. He promised transformation, diversity in media voices, and a shift away from what he called the neoliberal, Western-centered media framing that had long dominated South African newsrooms. The deal was initially celebrated in some circles. For years, media ownership had been concentrated in a handful of mostly white-controlled companies. A black-owned media house sounded like progress. But some raised red flags quite early on. The Public Investment Corporation, or PIC, which manages government workers' pensions, had controversially financed a significant portion of the deal. Critics began to question not just the editorial direction of the papers, but who was truly pulling the strings. It wasn't long before those fears would be realized. The new era of independent media under Sekunjalo began with promises of transformation. But those promises were soon tested, publicly and very controversially. On the weekend of 6 December 2013, Alida de Nooys, editor of Cape Times, was abruptly removed from her post. The timing could not have been more sensitive. Nelson Mandela had just passed away. Management claimed that Alida failed to give appropriate front-page coverage to Madiba's death. But this narrative quickly began to unravel, because under her leadership, the Cape Times had in fact published a special wraparound tribute edition that was dedicated to Mandela. Time magazine even listed it among the top 15 Mandela covers globally. So if not Mandela, what was the real reason? That same edition of the Cape Times also ran a story that cited a scathing report from Public Protector Thuli Madonsela. The report found that the Department of Agriculture, which was then led by Tina Jumat Peterson, was guilty of maladministration and improper conduct. At the heart of the scandal was the awarding of an 800 million tender to a company in the Sekunjalo group. Critics saw the removal of Alida as retaliation, a direct attack on editorial independence, and it triggered a firestorm. Media watchdogs, including the SA National Editors Forum, or SANEF, the Freedom of Expression Institute, the Right to Know campaign, and the International Federation of Journalists, came out in strong support of Alida. They warned that her dismissal threatened the credibility and independence of journalism in South Africa. The backlash reached far beyond media circles. Legal threats from Sekunjalo, internal turmoil at the Cape Times, and broader concerns about interference in editorial decisions started to cast a long shadow over the promise of transformation. In 2014, Alida was awarded the Nat Nakasa Award for Courage and Integrity in Journalism. The judges praised her bravery, her integrity, and the courage in standing by her journalistic principles, despite the immense pressure from powerful interests. For many, this was the moment where optimism about the Sekunjalo takeover began to fracture. A newsroom was no longer just a newsroom, it was a battleground. Following the ousting of Alida, the climate inside independent media's newsroom grew increasingly uneasy. Journalists began to speak of editorial interference, political pressure, and an erosion of the independence that once defined the newspaper group. In the years that followed, a quiet but steady exodus began, one that would fundamentally change the makeup of South Africa's most iconic newspapers. Between 2013 and 2016, more than 20 senior journalists and editors either resigned, were pushed out, or saw their roles dramatically change. Many were veteran voices who had helped to shape post-apartheid journalism. Key departures include Ryland Fisher, Max Dupree, and Chris Whitfield. All resigned or distanced themselves from the group, citing concerns about independence. Tony Hurd, a former Cape Times editor and struggle journalist, left amid mounting tensions. Mushweshwe Munare, the Star's editor and respected journalist Yana Marais, also walked away. Inside the group, editorial direction began to shift. There was an increasing push for stories that aligned with the owner's narratives, what critics began to call loyalty journalism. Coverage of government failings was softened or sidelined. Criticism of President Jacob Zuma, for example, was played down during a time when public outrage over state capture and corruption was at its peak. Some journalists were offered more favorable positions if they towed the line. Others found themselves silenced, sidelined, or targeted. Newsroom culture, once based on rigorous editorial debate, was now driven by loyalty to ownership and increasingly to Sekunjalo Executive Chair Dr. Iqbal Survé himself. Transformation in this context became a double-edged sword, praised as necessary by some and weaponized by others as a tool for loyalty tests. Then came that infamous saga of the 10 babies. Independent's Pretoria News claimed a woman had birthed 10 babies. It went viral, it was explosive, but investigations could find no evidence, and 4 inquiries labeled it a hoax. Yet, Dr. Iqbal doubled down, undermining credibility. Next, we saw staff retrenchments that really hit hard. Nearly a third were cut in late 2023. Staff were paid via questionable vouchers. CEOs and editors came and went, signaling some sense of deep instability. The exodus had reached crisis levels. Several newspapers, including the Cape Times, Pretoria News, and The Star, saw significant declines in both circulation and public trust. Journalism professor Glenda Daniels described the situation bluntly. She said, "What we are seeing is the collapse of editorial independence from within." And while Dr. Iqbal dismissed criticism as sour grapes from disgruntled former staff, the growing list of resignations told its own story. As seasoned journalists left and editorial independence crumbled, another shift began to take shape. A new type of content emerged in the independent media publications. Not quite journalism, not quite propaganda, but something in between. Critics began calling it infotising, a blend of information and advertising, or sometimes opinion posing as fact. Independent newspapers, once considered bastions of tough journalism, began featuring more opinion pieces than investigations. Many of these came from the executive chairman himself, Dr. Iqbal Survé, who published long open letters, often painting himself as a victim of a media conspiracy or defending allies like the ANC or President Jacob Zuma. Headlines like "The real state capture is by the banks," or "white monopoly media wants to silence black voices," appeared along PR-styled pieces about Sekunjalo and its various companies. Balanced reporting gave way to curated narratives. Stories that favored Sekunjalo's interests were amplified. Those critical of the company, the ANC, and the Zuma-aligned network were downplayed or ignored entirely. That style echoed what South Africans had just witnessed during the Bell Pottinger scandal, a PR firm that was hired to stoke racial tensions and manipulate narratives during state capture. Although no direct link was established between Sekunjalo and Bell Pottinger, the editorial tone of independent media started to mirror that same strategy: shift blame, question critics' motives, and constantly position ownership as under attack. Several high-profile smear campaigns emerge in the pages of INMSA titles. Journalists from rival publications were attacked in editorials. Civic society leaders and even business executives were painted as agents of foreign influence or as anti-transformation. These weren't isolated cases. Media analysts noted a clear pattern. Editorial space used to settle scores and advance the business and political interests of ownership. This marked a seismic change from watchdog to weapon. SANEF repeatedly raised the alarm, issuing statements warning that independent media was blurring the lines between journalism and propaganda. So did organizations like the Right to Know campaign and Media Monitoring Africa, which began tracking the tone and content of INMSA's front pages. Yet for many South Africans, especially readers in townships and rural areas, these papers remained trusted sources, even as their content became increasingly partisan. Examples of these can be seen in how, for instance, IOL also used contrived bylines such as Jamie Ross, which was later identified as a pseudonym for, likely that was used for like pro-Iqbal content, with fabricated personas behind propaganda-style narratives. Take Stratcom allegations against journalists in April 2018, for instance, where all Sekunjalo-owned newspapers ran coordinated front-page attacks, branding anti-Sekunjalo journalists like Anton Harbour and Thandeka Gqibelembeki as apartheid-era Stratcom agents, suggesting a conspiracy to discredit Sekunjalo. This synchronized top-down editorial directive suggested a loss of newsroom autonomy. Sekunjalo-linked outlets accused mainstream media of conducting coordinated disinformation campaigns. They positioned themselves as under attack while dismissing critical reporting as biased. These examples could go on and on and on. This pattern wasn't accidental. No, it was calculated. It was the use of editorial space to weaponize the pages. The growing influence of Dr. Iqbal and Sekunjalo in the media space raised eyebrows far beyond the newsroom. Enter the Public Investment Corporation, the PIC, South Africa's largest asset manager, entrusted with over 2 trillion in assets, mostly from government workers' pensions. It wasn't just a financial institution, it was a guardian of public trust. And in 2013, shortly after Sekunjalo acquired independent media, the PIC extended a 1 billion loan to Sekunjalo Independent Media to support the acquisition, a highly controversial move. Critics questioned, why would the PIC fund a private media acquisition, especially when concerns about editorial independence were already surfacing? But it didn't stop there, because in 2018 it was revealed that the PIC had also invested over 4.3 billion into Iqbal's Ayo Technology Solutions, a Sekunjalo-linked tech company. The red flags were immediate. Ayo's evaluation was pegged at 14.8 billion, despite having limited assets and modest revenues at the time. Internal PIC memos showed serious doubts from investment professionals, concerns that were ultimately overridden. What followed was a forensic unraveling. In 2019, the Mbati Commission, officially the Commission of Inquiry into Allegations of Impropriety at the PIC, began public hearings that placed Sekunjalo and Ayo under the spotlight. Testimony after testimony painted a disturbing picture. Due diligence was ignored, risk protocols bypassed, and pressure from top leadership within the PIC, including then CEO Dan Matjila, to push through questionable investments. One of the most explosive revelations, leaked emails and WhatsApp messages showing attempts by Sekunjalo-linked executives to influence editorial coverage to defend their business dealings.
Very easy for Dr. Survé, Mr. Abdullah, or whomever during the group to say, guys, we need an article to come out. This is what the article should say. This is what people should be quoted. So an example is a guy like Dennis George, for instance. He'd be called after the article has been written to say, we're going to attribute these quotes to you. Kevin Hardy can speak for himself, how when the BT transaction was announced, he was quoted as having said that 600 people will be coming across. Now, firstly, that's factually incorrect. Only 50 people are going to come across from BT. But because the editorial independence of independent media does not exist, it sits in the hands of Dr. Iqbal Survé. Anything he says he wants to publish will be published. And again, we've been victims of that, given our stance and inability to play ball as they would like us to. But the factual reality is all power sits with one person. And even though you have good people in there, I'm pretty sure for their jobs and livelihoods, they will toe the line as per Dr. Survé's wishes.
Dr. Iqbal would hit back, accusing the commission of being politically motivated. In interviews and editorials, he insisted the inquiry was a witch hunt, part of a broader campaign to undermine transformation in media and business. But for many South Africans, the evidence was stark. The media empire began with promises of transformation, and black empowerment was now deeply entangled in allegations of financial mismanagement, media capture, and reputational decline. Even the PIC, which was meant to protect civil servants' retirement money, was left exposed. Independent media's decline stands as a cautionary tale. When journalistic integrity and editorial independence are compromised, democracy itself is diminished. But from the rubble, new digital outlets are rising. They're rising to carry the torch forward. But that legacy, that foundation, is one that was laid by the original trusted independent newspapers that we know from before. Thank you for joining me in today's episode. I certainly hope that you learned something new today from this, and that you'll constantly remember that we never want to see a media that loses integrity and that loses editorial independence, especially where newspapers are concerned. From myself, on a chair, it is goodbye.